We've been looking for a couple of weeks now at America's foundations and the background of America. And certainly it was started as a nation that was committed to God. It was started by a group of individuals who sought to honor God in everything that they did, certainly insofar as the founding of the nation. That certainly has changed. And so today, what I'd like to do is talk about how that changed and why that changed. And a lot of this, I think you'll find, relates to what's going on today. And so I want to talk not about the founders of America, but the refounders, because over the past century, there has been a refounding and a redirection. Let me first speak about the great Basking Ridge oak. Now, I lived in Basking Ridge for many years. In fact, we lived there 3 times, moved away, came back twice, and now, of course, we're down in Florida. That tree that you see on the screen is about a 600-year-old tree. George Washington and General Lafayette picnicked beneath that tree. George Whitefield preached under the tree. In fact, when he preached there in Basking Ridge, the town had a population of 300, and there were over 7,000 that came to hear him. It was the gathering place for Christmas caroling year after year after year for over 300 years. And there were many Christmases where I and my family would go down to see the Christmas tree lighting, which was right across the street from the great oak. And there would be crowds underneath the great oak watching. And this great oak really was the symbol of Basking Ridge, New Jersey. And whenever you would see anything put out by the town, it would have this picture of the great oak under it. And then something horrible happened. In 2017, the great Basking Ridge oak died. Tears flowed as the 600-year-old New Jersey tree was being cut down, the newspaper said. Another said, breaking news. Many cried and watched in horror as the historic 600-year-old Basking Ridge oak tree, which has died, was cut down on Monday. Residents looked on in horror and sadness as one by one the branches of the mighty oak tree in Basking Ridge were taken down on Monday morning. That's so sad, they said. That's horrible. It's heartbreaking. One local even cringed as she heard the cracking of the branches. She noted, it's like the cracking of the bones of a living thing. It died because its roots were destroyed when workers used a toxic cleaning solution on the gravestones beneath it. And just as in America, there are those trying to improve our nation based upon what they think best. I would suggest to you that we are seeing a toxic concoction that will ultimately destroy this nation from the very roots if it is not stopped and if things do not change, and if God does not intervene. We're in the midst of the great American battle, which goes back actually to its founding, and that is a righteous nation or a secular nation. Which are we? We were a righteous nation. The founders chose to create a righteous nation. George Washington said our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. James Madison spoke about the necessity of the 10 Commandments. He said, we have staked the whole future of American civilization, not on the power of government, far from it. We have staked the future of all of our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves, to control ourselves according to the 10 Commandments of God. It was the belief of the founders that a people could only run their own country if they could first run their own lives, and that the necessity for them to be able to do that was so critical that the government needed to be involved in giving them the basics for running their own lives. And they believed that those basics were the 10 Commandments of God. And that by teaching the youngest children and by teaching everyone in our society these commandments, they then would create the character necessary in the people so that they would vote for the things that were most important for the people and not just the things that were most important for themselves. Now, a byproduct of Americans' Christian roots was tolerance. Tolerance is rare around the world. Patrick Henry spoke, and he said, it cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians, not on religions, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ. For this very reason, he said, peoples of other faiths have been afforded asylum, prosperity, and freedom of worship here. Well, the role of the Bible in America has been substantial. It was the textbook for our educational system up until the early years of the last century. It was the basis for our laws. It was used as a science text, and indeed many scientific discoveries were made as people read its pages. It was for many years, in fact, for most of the last three centuries, the basis for morals and for decency. It was at the very core of American society. And Congress, as its first action, actually printed over 20,000 Bibles. The Bible is the soil that enriches the root of liberty. And we can read in the scriptures, the Bible is the perfect law that gives liberty. Where there is no revelation, the people perish. Many times that's translated as where there is no vision, the people perish. But the correct translation from the original language is revelation, speaking specifically of the Bible. In other words, destroy the Bible, yank it out of a society, and the people struggle, suffer, and ultimately perish. And then in the book of Daniel, the entire book is about the need for nations to acknowledge that God is above them, for leaders to humble themselves before God and acknowledge that they serve at the will and whim of the Creator. In Daniel chapter 4, verse 17, we read, "Know that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes." But we have become a secular nation, and we can see it in so many different ways. And this is a very, very short list that I've got here. No Bible reading or prayer in schools. The Ten Commandments have been forbidden in the classroom. Abortion on demand is the law of the land. Christmas and Easter breaks have been terminated so that the public schools no longer recognize Christianity in any obvious way. Gay marriage has been legalized. The cross has been removed from various cities' seals, Los Angeles and others. And churches most recently have been closed while bars and casinos were permitted to stay open. Churches were not deemed essential businesses. The Refounders. Now, these are not pictures of all of them, but these are pictures of some. Some you might recognize, many you probably don't. But these are the people who worked to undo the Judeo-Christian foundation of America. Saul Alinsky established the method of the refounding. He was a community organizer. Now, that name, community organizer, may be familiar to your ears because, you know, a recent president was a community organizer before becoming president. That is actually a euphemism for a radical activist. Alinsky was from Russia. And when he came here, he came to Chicago. He escaped the persecution in Russia and determined that he would never be persecuted again. And he wanted to find out how those who were outsiders were able to gain power, how the unempowered became empowered. Well, when he came to Chicago, he made friends with Frank Nitti and Al Capone, of all people, and he studied and codified their methods for organizing unions. In fact, Frank Nitti walked him around through most of the rackets and explained how they had set them up. He also studied Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini to understand how they came into power. And then he wrote a book, Rules for Radicals, which has become the Bible for community organizers. And in that book, he described the method that was used by Nitti and Capone, by Hitler and by Mussolini, and he put them in a set of 13 rules that could be used to gain power when you had none. And he dedicated the book to Lucifer, who he called the original rebel who gained his kingdom. The purpose of the Alinsky method, he said, was bottom-up change in the social order and working within the system in order to foment a revolution. He said the organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problem. So in other words, before solving anything, he said the organizer needs to create problems and needs to create issues. And he says, and organizations must be based on many issues. So not just one big issue, but multiple issues. The organizer must first rub raw the resentments of the people of the community, fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. He must search out controversy and issues rather than avoid them. For unless there is controversy, people are not concerned enough to act. An organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent. Okay, so a community organizer going into an area of a city is not there to make everybody happy. Their first goal is create issues or problems. And then Alinsky said the despair is there. In other words, there is despair that you find in the inner city. Now it's up to us to rub raw the sores of discontent, galvanize them for radical social change. Then an interesting point he makes. He says, control healthcare and you control the people. Now, he was writing these things and formulating them in the 30s and the 40s. There was no nationalized healthcare at that point. In the beginning of his book, in the prologue, he writes this: as an organizer, I start from where the world is as it is, not as I would like it to be. That means working in the system. And he says any revolutionary change must be preceded by passive, affirmative, non-challenging attitude toward change among the mass of our people. In other words, you have to so disrupt the society and the social order that change is the order of the day, that everything becomes different from what it was. You may be sensing that some of that is happening right now. The people must feel frustrated, so defeated, so lost, so futureless in the prevailing system that they are willing to let go of the past and chance the future. This acceptance is the reformation necessary to any revolution. In other words, a crisis is necessary to get the populace to accept massive change. How many people do you think would have been in favor of a $3 trillion budget overrun a year ago? But in the midst of a crisis, it becomes something that people accept and even welcome. And then this famous quote that you've heard repeated by so many: never let a crisis go to waste. That's from Saul Alinsky. That's part of his method. Use every crisis, the ones you create, the ones you foment, and the ones that just happen. So a community organizer's goal is agitation. A revolutionary organizer, he said, must shake up the prevailing power of their lives, agitate, create disenchantment and discontent with the current values, to produce, if not a passion for change, at least a passive, affirmative, non-challenging climate. The people don't know what will work, but they do know that the prevailing system is self-defeating, frustrating, and hopeless. They won't act for change, but won't strongly oppose those who do. The time is then ripe for revolution. True revolutionaries do not flaunt their radicalism, he said. They cut their hair, they put on suits, and they infiltrate the system from within. In other words, you can have somebody who looks exactly like what you would assume a leader should look like, and yet that person can be totally radicalized. Now, the stated purpose of Rules for Radicals is in the first chapter, right at the very beginning. His first words in paragraph 1: what follows is for those who want to change the world from what it is to what they believe it should be. The Prince was written by Machiavelli for the haves on how to hold power. Rules for Radicals is written for the have-nots on how to take it away. In this book, he said, we are concerned with how to create mass organizations to seize power. This means revolution. Okay, this is Saul Alinsky. Even more devious was that he said, it is not do the ends justify the means, but does this particular end justify this particular means? And there was no limit in his mind as to what the means might be, including murder. He quotes Lenin, and he says, Lenin was a pragmatist. When he returned to what was then Petrograd from exile, he said the Bolsheviks stood for getting power through the ballot, but would consider after they got the guns. And then he speaks about himself and his own plans, and he says, they have the guns, and therefore we are for peace and for reformation through the ballot. When we have the guns, then it will be through the bullet. Okay, so that is part of Alinsky's method, his plan. Alinsky's rules encourage lying to gain power via stealth and other techniques, and then once power is secured, do whatever it takes to consolidate power, including violence. If you've not read Rules for Radicals, I would recommend that you read it, as well as his second book, Revelry for Radicals. In his book, Revelry for Radicals, he speaks about how critical it is to enlist the black segment of our population, to get the minorities, but particularly the blacks, because he said, in the inner city, power is in the hands of the black pastors. And he said this, the nation desperately needs the organized power of our black sector and its representatives. Give them hope, because the hopeless don't revolt, because revolution is an act of hope. And he appeals to blacks to foment change. He said, black culture without power is castration. We must have more black organizers who will do the job. And he said, the social changers go by many names, agitators, revolutionaries, catalysts, and outside troublemakers, even the generation gap. Well, interestingly, more than interestingly, Barack Obama was an Alinsky-trained community organizer. He had 3 jobs before becoming senator from Illinois, and he had his jobs in organizations that were either founded by Saul Alinsky or by followers of Saul Alinsky. His first job, he worked for the Industrial Areas Foundation, teaching Saul Alinsky's methods. Now, the Industrial Areas Foundation was a Chicago-based community organizing network that was established in 1940 by Saul Alinsky himself in order to, quote, build organizations whose primary purpose is power, the ability to act, and whose chief product is social change, unquote. And then he was a community organizer and director of the Developing Communities Project in Chicago. In theory, according to Barack Obama, this is from his, he wrote a book called After Alinsky. In theory, community organizing provides a way to merge various strategies for neighborhood empowerment. Again, all about power. Organizing begins with the premise that 1, the problems facing inner city communities do not result from a lack of effective solutions, but from a lack of power to implement these solutions. And 2, that the only way for communities to build long-term power is by organizing people and money around a common vision. And 3, that a viable organization can only be achieved if a broadly based indigenous leadership, and not 1 or 2 charismatic leaders, can knit together the diverse interests of their local institutions. And then his third job was with Project Acorn, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now. And a principal goal of Acorn was voter registration. They also handled subprime mortgages and lobbied Congress. And then, interestingly, at Project Acorn, Obama taught the Alinsky method as well as serving as their legal counsel. And then he also was involved in Project Vote, which is an offshoot of Acorn. And the mission of Project Vote was to empower, educate, and mobilize low-income, minority, youth, and other marginalized and underrepresented voters. And he said that would focus specifically on Americans of color. And through that, he gained a great understanding of how our system of voting in America works. Now, this is interesting. L. David Alinsky, the son of Saul Alinsky, wrote a letter to the Boston Globe, and you probably can still find it in their archives or online. I have a copy of it. And it was August 31st, 2008. So it was the day after the 2008 Democratic National Convention nominating Barack Obama as president. And here's the text, or actually a portion of the text. There's more, and I think you'd find it interesting to choose to read it. Quote, the Democratic National Convention had all the elements of the perfectly organized event, Saul Alinsky style. I am proud to see that my father's model for organizing is being applied successfully beyond local community organizing to affect the Democratic campaign in 2008. It is a fine tribute to Saul Alinsky as we approach his 100th birthday. In other words, the campaign that Barack Obama ran, he ran in the same way that he acted as a community organizer. He used the Alinsky method in order to win the nomination. Now, from that, we move on to two others who were influenced by Saul Alinsky. Two professors from Columbia University, Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven, sociology professors at Columbia. And, people generally don't know their name. They might have heard of the Cloward-Piven strategy, but these two are barely known. They're married. They were married. Richard Cloward passed away some years back. Their historical relevance, though, is being seen throughout America right now as we watch the civil unrest, the rioting, the looting, and so on. Barack Obama, by the way, studied at Columbia during their tenure. We believe he took courses from them. I cannot confirm that. He certainly knew them. And the reason I say that he knew them is they stood on the dais at both of his inaugurations, not very far from him on the platform. Well, the Cloward-Piven strategy was this: collapse the state. Collapse the state in order to create a potential for revolution, specifically overwhelm it with debt. They wrote an article in March of 1966 in The Nation magazine that was entitled, "The Weight of the Poor, A Strategy to End Poverty." They applied the Alinsky technique, and they intended to create the mother of all crises to foment the destruction of capitalism in America so that it could be replaced with a socialist state. The central element of the Cloward-Piven strategy involved nothing less than economic sabotage against the United States. Cloward and Piven theorized that, quote, a condition of overwhelming tension and strain could be engineered through the overloading of American welfare rolls, thereby smothering the entitlement program structure at the state and local level. The implosion of welfare benefits would facilitate a massive spike in poverty and desperation, creating a financial crisis that would lead to an even greater cycle of demand for a fully socialized system. This desperation would then force the federal government to concentrate all welfare programs under one roof, nationalize and enforce a socialist ideology, and ultimately compact an immense level of power into the hands of a select few. That was their plan. Well, the first implementation had mixed results. In the 1960s, they worked hard to push the whole concept of the Great Society. And welfare law changes were made, and welfare was handed out far more easily. They worked hard at that. They were in and living in New York City, and so they had primary focus in New York. And the basic approach that they used ultimately wound up with the city in massive debt and finally having to declare bankruptcy. And they declared that bankruptcy as a result of the overextension of the welfare rolls, amongst other things. Well, they were dissatisfied with the results because it was obvious that this nation was too robust to be brought down by their strategy. And so they extended the strategy to the voter rolls with the passage of the motor voter law. And there you see Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward standing behind President Clinton as he signs the National Voter Registration Law, which is dubbed the Motor Voter Law. The goal was to overwhelm the voting systems with so many people voting and to make it impossible to determine whether or not a voter was indeed a legitimate voter. Each state, per the National Voter Registration Law, needed to include a voter registration form as part of an application for a state driver's license and any application for driver's license renewal. And they only required the bare minimum amount of information necessary to prevent duplicate voter registrations. Okay, so goal was make it so easy that you could overwhelm the voter rolls. Now, having dealt with Alinsky and the method and some strategies, you really have to go back to 1919, 1920, when the American Civil Liberties Union was founded, because this is a group of refounders that worked to change the laws without changing the wording of the laws. And a few well-known founders: John Dewey, father of modern education. He was also a Socialist Party candidate for president and was an atheist son of a minister. Clarence Darrow, who was an atheist attorney in the Scopes trial. We'll talk more about these folks in a moment. Norman Thomas, six-time Socialist candidate for president. And Upton Sinclair, a muckraker, the author of The Jungle, Socialist Party for Congress in New Jersey, for California governor as a socialist, and a man who was religious as a boy, agnostic, perhaps atheist as an adult. Now, at the time, the founding purpose of the ALU was established as a direct result of the Palmer raids. The end of World War II, you had Bolsheviks who had planted bombs, and there were 100 bombs sent to congressmen. There was an Italian suicide bomber who blew himself up in Congress. And there was just a fear of a communist revolution in the United States of America. And that was a period called the Red Scare. There was a movie made about it that takes quite a few liberties called Reds some years back. But it is a real event in American history. And the people responded, and A. Mitchell Palmer, who was the Attorney General, responded. His assistant, by the way, was J. Edgar Hoover. And they raided any places that they knew had communist sympathizers, and they arrested 10,000 suspected communists and anarchists on the 7th of November 1919. Now, there was real fear amongst people that we were going to see the same kind of Bolshevik revolution here that they had seen in Russia. And so you can understand the tenor of the times. Well, Roger Baldwin was one of those who was jailed. And he and most of the others were released sometime later. And when he was released, they threw a big party for him at his home. And the group that was there determined that they would never let this happen again. And they founded the American Civil Liberties Union with Roger Baldwin as its founding director. And he remained as director of the American Civil Liberties Union for 30 years. Now, in his college yearbook, you can get a little glimpse of what he believed. He said, "I am for socialism, disarmament, and ultimately for abolishing the state itself as an instrument of violence and compulsion. I seek the social ownership of property, the abolition of the propertied class, and sole control of those who produce wealth. Communism is the goal." His strategy, and this is a picture of him on the left when he's a bit older, do steer away from making it look like a socialist enterprise. Too many people have already gotten the idea that it is 9/10 a socialist movement. We want also to look like patriots in everything we do. We want to get a lot of good flags, talk a good deal about the Constitution and what our forefathers wanted to make of this country, and to show that we are the folks that really stand for the spirit of our institutions. Well, you can see that it was nothing of the sort. ACLU ultimately was successful in redefining the First Amendment, and you can see on some of their sites how they have redefined it. The Establishment Clause requires the separation of church and state. Well, obviously, that phrase, separation of church and state, is not in the Constitution, but most people today think it is. And a lot of that is a direct result of the American Civil Liberties Union and their assaults. They continued on. Assaults on the freedom to believe continue both in Washington and in state legislatures around the country. The ACLU will continue working to ensure that religious liberty is protected by keeping the government out of the religion business. Now, you'll read from another one of their sites. That was from the Massachusetts ACLU. The First Amendment, the rights of free speech, free association, assembly, freedom of the press, and religious freedom, including the strict separation of church and state. Okay, and so their goal then was to not amend the Constitution, although they would if they could, but rather seeing that as being an insuperable task to try to get the support nationwide to amend the Constitution. They sought to use the judicial approach of stare decisis, basically looking at precedent and working to change the law by changing the interpretation of the law, even to the point of making it mean the direct opposite of what was intended. Separation of the church and state was not a phrase in the Bill of Rights. Rather, it goes back to Thomas Jefferson writing a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association of Danbury, Connecticut, really just to calm their fears. And they were worried that Congress was going to select a single Christian denomination to be the state denomination of the United States of America, and they were concerned that it was going to impinge on their religious freedom. Now, John Dewey, another one of the Refounders. In 1899, he wrote the book School and Society. He praised the educational system in Russia. He was a self-acknowledged anti-capitalist, a self-acknowledged anti-Christian. He was the signer of the Humanist Manifesto and may have indeed written the Humanist Manifesto. He was a founding member of the ACLU. He is referred to as the father of modern education. Here is a quote from an article about him by John Dunphy, titled A Religion for a New Age. Quote, I am convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers that correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith, a religion of humanity. The classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and new. And then this. The rotting corpse of Christianity, together with all its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism, resplendent with the promise of a world in which the never-realized Christian ideal of love thy neighbor will finally be achieved. That's John Dewey. And so much of what is modern education owes its existence to his theories, his approaches, his influence. Clarence Darrow, a great trial attorney, he was the atheist son of an agnostic Unitarian minister. In 1925, he defended John T. Scopes in the Scopes trial, the monkey trial. And the question being addressed was, can evolution be taught in the public schools? And what Darrow said was, in his presentations, that evolution should be taught alongside creation. Well, he lost the case in Tennessee, but ultimately they won the war. And today, this wouldn't even be a case. Can evolution be taught beside creation? Because creation is rarely taught in the public schools, and when it is, usually there are those who are antagonistic. Agnes Smedley. Now, Whittaker Chambers identified her as a Communist Party member. You may remember Whittaker Chambers from the days of Richard Nixon. Chambers was a communist, And on 1st January 1948, the Chicago Tribune carried a story claiming that Smedley was being investigated as part of a communist espionage ring based in Japan during the 30s. The article claimed that Smedley was working with the German journalist Richard Sorge, who was spying on the Japanese government on behalf of the Soviet Union, a founder of the American Civil Liberties Union. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a very interesting one. And as I was searching for information on her, I first started searching years ago before there was an internet, and I couldn't find anything in the library. I spent the better part of a day, maybe a day and a half, and then I came across a few references. Strangely enough, one was in the Encyclopedia Britannica, and what it indicated was that the bulk of the information on her is contained in the Communist Party Museum in New York City. She ran for Congress in New York, and she was a writer for the Communist Daily Worker, and she was president and national chairman of the American Communist Party. She was a founding director of the ACLU, and she was ultimately charged under the Alien Registration Act with advocating the violent overthrow of the U.S. government when such was a crime. Now, there was a 9-month trial, very public, 9 months. That's a long, major trial, a trial célèbre. And then she lost. She spent 5 years in jail. She went to Russia and then years later came back here. When she died, she was given a state funeral in Red Square in September of 1964. And when she returned home prior to that from Russia, here is an interesting quote. Finally, Elizabeth returned home to New York. One of the first things she did was to go to the offices of the Communist Party in Union Square and become a member. And then the American Civil Liberty Union welcomed her return by voting her a seat on the board of directors. George Washington said this. I won't go through all of the others who were founding members of the ACLU, but they have similar biographies. George Washington said, and let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail on the exclusion of religious principle. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So the methods of Saul Alinsky clash very directly with the concepts, the ideas, the beliefs of our founders. They felt they were building a nation that required moral people who were concerned not about their own interests, but about the greater good. And that they could encourage such morality in the people by emphasizing the importance of religion, specifically Christianity and the Ten Commandments. And so if the roots are removed, and Alinsky clearly attacks the roots, and his disciples clearly attack the roots, then what happens? Well, then we get to where we are right now, and we need to pray. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayers offered in this place. 2 Chronicles 7:14. And the things that we need to do, we need to pray, because prayer is the power that moves the hand of God. We need to vote. 37% of evangelicals did not vote in the last election. The people we elect are the people who will decide the future. For now, we are the government. It may not always be that way, but for now, we the people decide. And so it is critical that each of us embrace our civic responsibility, even our responsibility before God, to vote, to understand the issues, to understand the people, to understand the policies, and to vote wisely. And then speak up. Silence is taken as our assent when others speak and we do not. Thank you very much.